Hey guys, the fact is that there is not going to be a housing crash as many of you have thought there were going to be for probably the last 2 or 3 years since the COVID pandemic. And I can tell you why, and these are the reasons why. As we get into it, I'm going to explain to you the inventory, the housing inventory can show you a clear sign of why there's not going to be a housing crash. So let me dig into this a little bit. And I got my notes over here. Let me dig in. Many of you, I don't know how many of you out there were in the housing crash. I actually started my career in '05, so I was a part of the housing crash. But for those of you that don't remember, that happened back in 2008. And many of us didn't own a home at that time. But there's so many people that did. And so they went through the trauma of 2008 and what proceeded beyond 2008 to about 2012. So those people are kind of in shock, especially if they own homes now, whereas they don't want to sell or they're not putting them on the market in many cases because they're like, oh my gosh, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I'm going to explain to you really quickly why that's not going to happen. First off, if you think that's going to happen, the good news is that we're in a much different position than we were in 2008 here in 2023. One of the most important reasons to think about is that we really just don't have enough homes to sell. And that's probably the biggest factor in why we're not going to have a crash. So when you start to think about it, we're in undersupply of inventory. Well, in order to be able to do a crash, you got to be in an oversupply of inventory. And that's exactly where we were back in 2008. So that's the first big factor. But let's look at some of my notes here, and I see here saying, the let's talk about the housing supply and where it comes from because it comes from three main sources. Your first main source, of course, is going to be homeowners deciding to sell their home. Your second one is going to be newly built homes, or as many of you guys know, new construction or builders. Those are your KB homes, those are your DR Hortons, those are your Perry homes, et cetera, et cetera. And then your third category that's going to, or main source of inventory is going to be distressed properties. So those will be foreclosures, those will be short sales. All of these play a role in your level of inventory. So what I want to show you, and I'm going to show you here, let me share my screen here, is what I want to show you is let's look at, bam, let's look at what the average annual inventory of home sales chart shows us. And what it's showing you here is that although housing supply did grow compared to last year, so last year, between last year and this year, we have gone up. It's still low in comparison to what our averages are. The current inventory level is definitely below the norm, and that's shown clearly here on the graph. If you look, that is the green bar where it says now right at the bottom. You see that one there? That one right here? That's showing 3.3 months of inventory. That's not a lot of homes to sell. Okay. And so when you look at that in comparison to 2008, which is right here, that red bar, we had 10.4 months of inventory back then. So we're not even at a third of the amount of inventory that we were at back when the housing crash happened, let alone many of the other factors that we're not going to get into, which include things like mortgage and that whole regulation. None of that stuff is going on anymore. So what does this mean? This basically means exactly what I said in the very beginning. There just aren't enough homes available to make home values drop at such a rate that you're like, whoa, we're about to go into a housing crash. So those of you that's been sitting on the fence as buyers, that's been waiting for this 10, 15, 20% drop, it is just not going to happen. And a lot of that is because of the inventory levels that we have. So you, in order for us to make those a big drop in pricing, we would definitely have to have more inventory. Because when you have more inventory in place, it's kind of like supply and demand. When we talk about supply and demand, if I don't have a lot of homes, like in this particular case, we are undersupplied, but I still have a lot of buyers that want to buy, that was fifth grade math. You know what I mean? That's when they said, well, supply and demand says demand is high and supply is low. So those prices are going to continue to rise. And when you flip that, that's when you start to see prices go down. So let's talk about that second part of the inventory where we were talking about new construction. And yes, I have a graph for that one as well. That's this one here. Bam. Newly built homes. When you think about new construction, I mean, look at that. Look at the bar graph. Look where the average annual units are, and where these are for completed homes. So when you're talking about what's going on in newly built homes in this time, you might wonder if the home builders are overdoing. I don't think they are. I think they're just filling a gap. But the graph can show you that the homes over the last 52 years. So this is from 1970 basically till today. And if you even look back the last 14 years, you can see we were well below the average. And that was during that gap. But if you notice one thing right out the gate, we are rising every single year. Every single year it's been going up. Builders are gaining more confidence, so builders are starting to build more homes. So when you look at the 14 years, you know, that is probably one of the primary reasons why we're in such a low inventory level, because we just haven't had a lot of new construction homes being built at that rate. A lot of it due to fear, but there was a deficit in supply. So while the final blue bar on the graph shows, if you're looking at, that's this bar right here, that we're ramping it up and it's on pace to hit the long-term average again, it won't suddenly create an oversupply, because you also got to remember there's a delay. They're building them, they're on pace to building them. Building homes are a 4 to 6 to 9 month time frame, depending on how big the property is and some of the other criteria. But you got to remember that we have a gap now that we're trying to make up. So the builders building is helpful and they're being intentional, but they're not going to overbuild like they did back in 2005, 6, and 7. That's just not going to happen. And so then when you start to look at the third factor that I said, which was distressed homes, and you're right, I do have a graph for that one too. Bam. The last place of inventory, when you start to think about the distressed homes, which include foreclosures and include short sales, back during that housing crisis back in 2007, 8, 9, and so on and so forth, there was a flood of foreclosures due to lending standards that allowed people to get a home that they really couldn't afford. So basically, they were buying homes basically on smoke. Let's just keep it real. They was buying homes on smoke. They was putting whatever they wanted on the paper. The lenders were allowing it to go through, and that's why we had so much fraud and situations that were going on with new homes at that time. And that's why we also had a flood of inventory that came through for foreclosures and short sales. Because at month 3, or if they were doing a adjustable and they weren't couldn't refinance because they didn't really qualify in the first place, their note shot up. and they couldn't pay for that. So after 3, 4 months, they start foreclosing or short selling those homes. So if you look at the graph, this is data from the Federal Reserve, and you can see how things have changed drastically in this graph. From you go back to 2008, right here, you can see where we were and how 2007 to 2009 we blew up in foreclosures and short sales. And now, if you look where we've constantly gone down the path, and even look here in this black area here, which was the COVID area, we were in a foreclosure moratorium. They couldn't even do foreclosures from much of the country. So the graph literally illustrates that lending standards got tighter and buyers had to be more qualified, and the number of foreclosures just started going down because of those requirements. And if you go back to 2021, the combination of the moratorium on foreclosures and the forbearance programs, which helped buyers stay in their homes, helped prevent a lot of the repeat waves of foreclosures and short sales that many people were expecting to happen. They were expecting it to happen. But most people stayed. I'll tell you something really quick that's interesting is when that during the COVID pandemic, when people were at home and funneling money back through their accounts, we found just in statistics that there's a lot of people that actually paid off their house, or they doubled down on their payments and went from 80% down to they only owe 50% or 40% of their home. So we are in 100,000 times of a better position than we were in back in 2007, 2008, when the whole bust happened. So to end off on the foreclosures, these forbearance programs, these people using the money and being smart about it and putting the money back in their house, they actually helped stop us from having a crazy bounce back once we kind of got out of the COVID pandemic. So what does this mean for you? Well, this is what it means for you. Inventory levels aren't anywhere near where they need to be for prices to drop significantly and the housing market to crash. So if you were waiting for either one of those, if you're waiting for it to crash or you were waiting for prices to drop like 20%, that's not going to happen due to those things I just explained to you. And if you really start to think about it, according to Bankrate, this isn't going to change anytime soon, especially considering the buyer's demand is still very strong because, people don't have to work in offices the way they did before, so they can live anywhere. People have different family situations now, or maybe mom's moving in or dad's moving in or the kids are moving back home. These situations are changing, and the COVID pandemic created that. So what's the bottom line? Here's the bottom line. The market doesn't have enough homes available for a repeat of the 2008 housing crash. And there's nothing that suggests, that will change anytime soon. That's why housing inventory tells us there's no crash on the horizon. But more importantly, if you are sitting on the fence as a buyer, you need to get out there and get your home. Because if housing continues to increase in price, that only lowers your affordability. You can always refinance the home later. So you can buy now at today's rate, refinance when the rate gets lower. But if you try and wait it out and say, I'm going to wait till next year or the year after, the same home that you're looking at today to buy will cost you more money. And you will not get the increase of appreciation or the equity gains that you would have if you own the house the last year or two. So really your best position as a buyer is to buy now. Now, I want to talk to my sellers out there too and give them a bottom line, because as a seller, if you're waiting for this market to get to a point where it's like 100% normal again, I, I would tell you my professional recommendation would be is you need to get out there as well, because with inventory levels at this where they are, and most importantly, remember what I just said about supply and demand. Supply is low, demand is high. So if I'm a seller, I should probably get my house out there while there's less competition because the supply is low and the demand is so high that it's going to drive my price up versus waiting for it to get normal because there's other people that's waiting on the fence just like you and they decide to jump out all at the same time. Well, guess what? Now you're one of 30 houses that are very similar versus now you're one of maybe three. Your choice, but I would recommend that strongly. As always, I hope this gave you some insight about the market and what's going on. If you got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can always see me on social media, or of course, you can call me at 832-257-9083. Have a great one, guys.